Hi everyone, and welcome to this first episode in my painting series for Atomic Mass Games' Marvel Crisis Protocol. In this episode I'm going to be painting Antman. I'll cover the basics of blending and layering, as well as a small introduction to non-metallic metal techniques like those seen here on Valkyrie. There'll also be an urban basing tutorial which I'll use across the episodes, referencing back to this one where necessary, but you can always skip to any of these points using the timestamps below. As you can see, the figure's already been assembled, actually for about 9 months, so it's high time that he had some paint on him. I've given him a zenithal prime, but this isn't strictly necessary as I'll only be using the prime for reference, so a plain black or grey would work fine here. When that is all dried though, we'll crack on with the base coats. We'll begin with the red of the suit, and I'll be basing this in deep red, desaturated with a little black. As always, I'll be thinning my paints on my palette and applying a couple of thin layers, using a couple of photos of the zenithal prime as a frame of reference once I begin highlighting. If you're using Citadel paint instead, then I'd suggest corn red as a good substitute here. And don't worry about being too neat, we can tidy up as we go later. Here I'm just applying the second base layer. For the black areas, I'll be using an equal mix of black and dark sea blue. Stegadon scale green would be a rough replacement here, but any dark blue should suffice. Once again, I'm applying my second layer to achieve a good opaque finish. And I'm now tidying up as I go. Finally, for the metal I'll be using Graphene Grey, again desaturated with some black. Graphene is a dark blue grey, so a mix of Mechanicus standard grey, a dark blue and some black should produce a similar hue. I'll use this for the helmet, backpack and the PIM particle controller on his arms. I'm desaturating all of these colours and keeping things dark as I won't be using any shades, opting instead to control the depth of my shadows and blend up from this base. I'm applying a second layer again as before, and when that's done, we'll be ready for some highlights. I'll begin by highlighting up the black, so starting with our base tone, I'll add white sands in gradual increasing amounts. Ceramite white with a hint of Screaming Skull would be a great substitute here. I'll apply this thinly over 90% of the black, leaving only the deepest recesses and shadows. I'm now increasing the saturation with the white sands, and I'll begin pushing up the values on the areas where light would naturally hit, using my zenithal photos as I said earlier. Notice how I'm drawing the brush towards the brightest points where possible, as it deposits the most pigment where it leaves contact with the figure. I'll keep building the white sands in the mix until I've reached a bright bluey grey. I don't want to push these highlights too far, as the suit isn't a bright reflective leather but more of a matte rubber type material. You can see I'm painting less and less of the area and stippling to create a more specular appearance. This is now my brightest highlight, though as you can see it isn't actually that bright at all. We'll now move on to the reds, starting with the deep red from our base mix. We'll blend this up in a couple of stages with some blood red, or Mephiston red if you're using Citadel, then Aldebaran Red, which is a cross between Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. Following that with a hint of Mars Orange or a desaturated Fire Dragon Bright, before lighting in it all with some white sands. You can see I've thinned the deep red down a touch before applying it to around 90% of the red areas, leaving only the darkest recesses and shadows again, as we did with the blacks. I'm now starting to blend the blood red into the mix, and I'm going to transition quite quickly through this as I want to build that vibrancy. And this is now the pure blood red. I'm now adding the Aldebaran Red into the blood red and continuing to blend this up. This gives us a really lovely soft saturated tone. You can see here that I'm focusing the highlights more towards the brighter parts now, reducing the area that I cover and freely mixing between the normal blends, stippling, hatching with small lines and edge highlighting where required. Now we've reached the pure Aldebaran Red. Stippling the paint as you see here really helps to build that sense of texture on the figure. To help really push the highlights up and better match the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'm now adding in some Mars Orange. I then mix some white sands in with the orange before adding this into our red mix. This helps to desaturate and up the value of our brightest highlights. For the metallic elements now, I'll be employing some basic non-metallic metal techniques, starting from our base tone and lightening it with some graphite, followed by some white sands. Something like Dawnstone would be an ideal alternative for the graphite if using Citadel colours. So as before here, I'm just blending the graphite and graphene on the palette before starting on the highlights. focusing on only very small areas and leaving the dark graphene over about 50%. The way to really make non-metallic metal sell when viewing your figure is through contrast. It wants to go from almost black to a small bright highlight quite rapidly. Edge highlighting is very important with this technique too, so you'll see me doing this a lot, using the flat of my brush as I go. I'm now using the pure graphite. This is only a rough introduction to the technique here, as you can see that he doesn't have any large areas of metallics to demonstrate the proper blending and shading methods. Suffice to say that this gives you the idea of the basics of how best to sell the effect. I'm going to try drawing the brush along the edges and towards the lower corners where the light would naturally reflect. I'll keep blending this up with the white sands, hitting smaller and smaller points and edges as I go. I'll cover this in far greater depth in later episodes. For the brightest points, I'll use a very small amount of pure white sands just to add those tiny glints. And with the figure now done, let's move on to the base. For the urban base, I'll begin with the Mechanicus standard grey for the curbstone and the concrete that Antman's posing on. I'll thin this a little and apply on a couple of thin coats. This scheme is very much based on Duncan Rhodes' urban base tutorial, just with some non-metallic metal elements thrown in, as well as some scenic rubbish and texture in later iterations. You should certainly check out some of his work, especially if you're a Games Workshop fan. I'll then be using Corvus Black on the road, thinning it down and applying as always in a couple of coats. Whilst I wait for the first coat of black to dry, I'm going to apply a light dry brush of Administratum Grey to both the concrete and the curb, being extremely careful around Antman himself. Here I'm just applying my second coat of the Corvus Black. I'll then paint the grate in Petroleum Grey and use Vallejo's Blue Grey Pale for the cup. So here I'm just thinning the grey. And I'm now basing the cup in. For both the base and the posing rubble, I'm going to freely blend some Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camoshade. So here I'm applying the Earthshade, then coming in with some of the Camoshade freely on top, and I'll mop any excess pooling up with my brush. I'm repeating the same process on the base, and I'll then leave this to dry completely before continuing. When that's dried, I'll stipple some Skavenblight Dinge onto the black road surface using my dry brush. Following that, I'll add some white sands to the blue-grey pale in a couple of stages and paint up the cup. I'll then use a little of our blood red from earlier to draw a small red square on it, which may look remarkably similar to a popular fast food chain. I'll then be using some Averland Sunset to draw in some road markings. These won't have to be too neat as we're going to weather them and they'll be mostly covered by the figure anyway. You could also add a letter M to the cup. To weather the lines, we'll take a piece of sponge, dip it into the Corvus Black and remove the excess before dabbing it over the yellow lines, leaving it with a rough texture. I'll then lighten the Petroleum Grey in a few stages with some white sands and highlight around the grate as we did for Antman himself, building that non-metallic metal effect again. Finally, I'll give the base and concrete a light dry brush of Screaming Skull before painting the rim in a matte black. Then supergluing the figure to the base, and once that's dried, giving it a coat of ultra matte varnish. This completes Antman. It's been great to finally get some colour on Antman, and I had a lot of fun returning to these figures. A full list of all of the paints used is on your screen and will be included in the description below. There are many more Marvel characters for me to paint, and if you enjoyed this episode then please hit that like button and subscribe to see more of this kind of content. On a personal note, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you that have subscribed already, as your support is helping me to push on and try to improve. I also want to thank Sir Astro's Painting for helping me to reach this level with my brush, and for the understanding he's given me of some of the schemes contained within. He really is the best teacher and you should totally check out his work. Until next time, bye for now.